Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a special Friday night panel. It is my pleasure to be here along with two brilliant brothers as we discuss. This is the Progressive Army presents part two of a five-part series on civil rights and Black Lives Matter. The root tonight's panel is the root of the problem: political, legal, and social. We're joined tonight by Michael Redwine, host of the Louisa Project 2027. And of course, yours truly, Benjamin Dixon, host of the Benjamin Dixon Show. And we're also joined by Brandon Sutton. He is a contributor to Project Sanity. All of them are part of the Progressive Army. Brandon is an anthropology PhD candidate. So we have a robust conversation tonight to just unpack from the historical perspective the issues facing the Black Lives Matter movement, the issues facing the Black community, and how historical factors have contributed to some of the systemic problems. And then if we can identify where those factors contribute, then surely we should be able to offer some recommendations as to how do we address the issue. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment, and I want to pass it over to Michael Redwine. And if he would just say a little bit about himself and what he wants to hope to bring to the conversation tonight. And then also I'll pass it over to, after that, we'll pass it over to Brandon Sutton and allow him to do the same. Michael Redwine.
Good evening, everyone. As Ben said, I'm Michael Redwine, the host of the Louisa Project 2027. I'm coming to this panel. One is preparing for the following panel, get used to this format. Number two, I really want to bring the average guy perspective to this. I mean, I've lived a fairly long life, and I've seen a lot of things around the world, and I'm hoping to bring a little bit of perspective to this conversation, broad perspective, make the conversation a little broader, and that's it. Brandon.
Hello, my name is Brandon Sutton. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology. And tonight, what we really want to do is situate Black Lives Matters, the Black Lives Matters movement, within the larger context, or rather within its larger context in American culture and society and history. So really help you guys understand how we got to this point. Black Lives Matter fits within just the American cultural phenomenon that we have.
Yeah. All right. So with that, I'd like to first start and say there is a difference. So Black Lives Matter, I think anyone who's been following this along with Black Lives Matter realizes that the Black Lives Matter is a couple of things. Black Lives Matter is an actual organization that has actual leadership, and they have a structure. We don't represent that structure. We don't represent that organization. Black Lives Matter is also a rallying cry, a chant, something that people galvanize and gather around. And that's not the focus of tonight. Tonight is the focus of the movement, the general movement that can be cast over this entire era of this era of civil rights movements. It is not the civil rights movement. It's the Black Lives Matter movement. So we're coming not as official anything with Black Lives Matter, because we're not a part of the official organization. And of course, we're not here during just to do the chant and the rallying cry and the war cry of Black Lives Matter, but we're here as an extension of the movement that's happening now that can be generally categorized as Black Lives Matter. So I just want to get that disclaimer, and special shouts out to the dynamic women who founded Black Lives Matter. I said something a long time ago, and I meant it. I said before this is over, before Black Lives Matter is over, they would have deserved a Nobel Peace Prize. And I don't say that. I'm not being coy when I say it. I'm not saying it haphazardly. I really mean it, because those three words catalyze a movement that really can and has already changed the world, but can change the world so much more. So special shout out to Elisa Garza, Opal Tometi. I can never pronounce your last name. I'm sorry. And then, of course, Patrice Colors, the founders of the official Black Lives Matter. So we want to just give them just a nod tonight. All right. So with that being said, let's shift gears and go back to Brandon. Brandon is the anthropologist of the group, and he has a perspective. Brandon, let's talk about that historical, structural, systemic process that's led us here. I want you to just jump in and start the conversation from there, and let's see where it grows.
Okay, well, if we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, we really need to understand that basically what they are is an anti-racist group. They are a group that is dedicated to anti-racism in all of its forms. Specifically, it's systemic form as represented by police brutality. And so I want to shift all the way back and really understand what we mean by racism and what we mean by race. And just go back to the beginning of these things and say, well, what is race? How did it begin? How did a definition? How do we come about this sort of categorization of each other based on a physical trait like skin color? If we're all okay with doing that, if we can all agree that's a good place to start. I don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
That's fine with me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
race and racism as ideas are inextricably linked. And where they come from specifically is, well, America. Let's be honest. We're talking about racism. We're talking about racism in America, but racism as we know it today was born in America. And by that I mean race is what people now refer to as a social construct, which basically means that it isn't real, for lack of a better word. But by not real, we mean that it is a social construct, a social term that we use, a category that we use to define each other, that is based on some physical trait that we have that otherwise plays no real part in our lives, other than the way we process sunlight and stuff like that. So what we say is that social constructs are things, for the most part, that are based on a biological reality, but they are not the only way we could categorize ourselves by. We could have decided that we would have a structure, a categorization based on height or hair color or eye color. Any of those things would have been equally viable, except for the fact that when the Constitution, at the time of the invention of race, brown people were already in slavery. So I think people don't really understand that blacks were slaves before race was a thing, at least the race the way we know it now. But the invention of race was a post hoc explanation that was born out of a cognitive dissonance that occurred with the Enlightenment and with, constant defining of the country that said that all people are equal. So there had to be a way to justify why certain people were not equal. There had to be a sort of, like lack of a better word, there had to be justification for that. And so you see early writings by people like Thomas Jefferson on the Notes on the State of Virginia. You see early natural philosophers as part of the American School of Anthropology defining race as this hierarchy and ranking system for the peoples of the world. And so racism is, as we brought, so when we talk about racism, we're usually talking about, the influx of power and prejudice, people who have power enforcing their prejudice on the world. But generally, academically, racism refers to the entire system of categorization that we have that places people into ranking and hierarchy based on what their skin color is. And so by ranking and hierarchy, what we mean is that one of these systems ranking is saying that you are morally better than people of a different skin color, while hierarchy is saying that you are more capable of them, or vice versa. I always get those two. I get those two confused. So racism, more broadly, is an entire system that we decide people are morally better or just generally more capable based on the color of their skin. And so that's what we would call an ascriptive system. And by ascriptive, the opposite of meritocratic, basically. It means that it's something that is done based on the way you're born and not the way you have achieved in society. If that makes sense.
Okay. No, it does.
I feel like it does.
Let me jump in there because I hear a couple of things that I think might be worth pointing out. The fact that you identify quickly that it's post.
One of the things that, as you were speaking, Brandon, one of the larger parts of of this conversation is that as we look at these structures, is that race largely was how we decided to, based on race, is how we decided to distribute resources, right? And that's a big part of what we're talking about here, and big part of what I want to get to, what we want to get to in this panel, is how the distribution of resources is impacted by race, and how we decided that who should be on top and who should be on the bottom.
Well, I mean, as I expressed, the people were already in the positions they were at when race and racism, when these categories and when this ranking was decided. So I think a lot of
I agree. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying the impact as far as distribution of resources.
at the beginning. Well, I mean, at the beginning there were
it's already distributed, right?
Yeah, it was already distributed.
Okay.
All right.
So
So,
you're saying,
can you guys let me jump in there right there. Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead, Brandon.
I thought that Ben was trying to speak.
You in there, Ben?
Can you guys hear me okay? 1, 2, 3.
No, Ben. Okay, go ahead, Brandon.
Okay, so well, it's going to be important for them to hear me. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and yield to Brandon and Mike, since they can hear each other. So Brandon and Mike, go ahead and run with it.
We can hear you now. We can definitely hear you now.
Perfect. All right, so this is the thing that jumped out on the pages to me when I was listening to you talk, Brandon, was the necessity to deal with that cognitive dissonance of where in the Enlightenment we see all people are created equal, all men are created equal. And then immediately it causes a conflict in their minds. So
David has to
after the
unmute
fact,
that window for us to hear Ben. Okay, sorry. Can you repeat your question, Ben? David.
Okay, so let's try it again. The third time's the charm. We're gonna get it here. All right. So
All right.
the necessity to make these definitions as a justification for the disparate treatment of Black and brown people during a time where we're declaring as human beings that all people are created equal. Unpack that a little bit more in the sense of the timing. You know, what time period you mentioned it was during the Enlightenment. What are some of the key, not only some of the key people, some of the key time frames, time points, you know, what set this in motion? And then more importantly, what catalyzed it and made it such a concrete factor in everything that we do, that before this point, race was almost non-existent. And after that point, race was inseparable from the plight of the average person.
Well, okay, so the Enlightenment is something that pretty much everyone learns about in school when they learn about history. Broadly speaking, it was a philosophical movement that spanned most of Europe, specifically in places like France, Germany, what would become the UK, so specifically Scotland and England, and what would become the United States of America. The basic philosophy, the Enlightenment was basically rejection of the notion of superstition and rather a superstition controlled world, and specifically the divine right of the king to rule. That's what's really important here. So when we say the Enlightenment, the basic tenets of the Enlightenment that came out of it were the idea of the social contract that people had, that the sovereign, or rather that the government, that the state gained its legitimacy to rule from the acquiescence of the people, that because the people supported the state, that is what allowed the state to rule, not the divine right to rule that kings had normally enjoyed before then. Key people, I mean, this is something that I'm sure people have heard these names before. Adam Smith, basically all the founding fathers, with it Montesquieu, so people like that, people that named it, John Locke, Hobbes, not Calvin. Hobbes, not Calvin. People that people that we've heard of before. But the United States, the American Revolution, was the first time that a country was being formed in a constitution and a governing body. I'm sorry, a governance. A government was being formed based on Enlightenment tenets, and so, but prior to this, the need to understand why. Prior to this, the need to understand why bondage did not exist. But as one of the central tenets of the Enlightenment was equality of all man, as a commentary for why the king was no better
Yeah.
than your average peasant, why there shouldn't be a feudal system, why
Mm-hmm.
there shouldn't be a lordship. It became necessary to examine the people in bondage within the United States
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
first and
Ooh.
foremost. And the way that was tackled was by essentially saying, well, these are not people. So a lot of
Right.
people don't really understand what the implications of racism were at the time, and that was basically that African slaves were they were savage. They were not people in the traditional sense of the word. That they needed to be put in bondage. Like they needed the yoke of the white man, the yoke of the state, to save them from their more savage ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think we can, we can see the parallels between what was set in stone then, as simply a way to justify an economic system that had existed prior to it, that didn't need justification, uh, after it was instituted.
So it puts more clearly the dilemma, right? So they're in a dilemma. They're simultaneously trying to establish equality with the king. Therefore, there's no need for a dynastic passage of authority. But then at the same time, needed to they were required to explain why, if they're equal with the king, why is the slave not equal to the master? And this becomes a huge dilemma because it's not just a moral question, it's an economic question, right? Because if that question was answered similarly to the way the founding fathers answered it with regards to the king, then we could have undermined the entire economic status quo of the period and just destroy the burgeoning American economy. So it was a moral question as well as an economic question. And we started seeing very specific actions that were taken to ensure that people understood that these slaves are not human. Therefore, they could not possibly be equal. We saw not only the language being written by Jefferson in some of his writings, but we also saw the treatment of slaves more barbaric. We saw the way we were portrayed in their writings during the period. We were portrayed as barbaric and as savages and dangerous. And these things became enshrined in our American psyche and American history. And so, what I'd like for you to do, Brandon, is take us from this initial onset of African peoples. African slaves are not human. They are savages and they are dangerous, and connect us to that same perception that is held by police officers when they see a black person. Their gut, oftentimes, their instinct is fear, and their instinct is this person is dangerous. Connect those dots for us.
Okay, so when we talk about the founding of America, we have to understand that race was very key to the founding of America. Americanness cannot be separated from its racial aspects. And I believe it was Frederick Douglass who once said, and there are actual parallels between what you said about the need for Bernie Sanders to coalesce the Reddit crowd and the black vote,
Oh yeah,
during the
yeah.
primaries. Frederick Douglass once said that there was there was an inseparableness between uh, there was this divide between Americanness and blackness that was the result of sort of America being founded upon these white supremacist notions, and that divide had never been closed. That this colonial mindset that was the result of this need to justify economic system morally and philosophically became uh, just never went away, because eventually it was ingrained into how we viewed
Yeah,
science. Uh,
yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I think we can all agree that had the founding fathers and the people of the time had just said, "Well, we need slaves because it's more expedient, it's more efficient economically. We want them. It is what it is." We'd be better off today because there wouldn't be that sort of baggage of racism and race
Mm.
attached to it. It would just be like, well, once it stopped being economically efficient, we stopped doing it, and then we had all these people. But that need arose, and it was simply never adequately tackled by any of our social systems. We just
Mm,
eventually, we eventually freed the slaves, but we didn't sort of get rid of the same mindset that had made them slaves in the first place. And that's how we get
mm,
from slave era in America to Jim Crow era America, where we still have this perception of a problem that we have this group of African African Americans, I guess, for lack of a better word at the time, freed slaves who are just as savage, still just as needing of the yoke of the white man. At least that was the mentality in certain parts of the country, north and south. So we need these new set of laws. So they can't be slaves, but they certainly can't be totally free. They definitely can't be
right.
totally equal to the white man, because that is just not within, that's not what our society is founded upon.
Hmm. Hmm. So let's dig. Okay, all right. This is about to be a great conversation. First of all, everybody share
Can
and
I
tweet
jump
the
in there real
link.
quick, Ben?
Let's get a couple of
I,
people in here and get this conversation, because there's something I'm gonna let you ask that question real quick, but there's something that
okay.
I want us to address, which is a clearer definition of white supremacy from the anthropological look. But go ahead with that question, whoever that was.
I'm sorry. When I have conversations like this, I like to kind of when we level set these discussions, I like folks to remember that prior to colonialism, Africa had thriving civilizations in place,
Oh
whether it
yeah,
be Carthage, Ethiopia, Egypt, Zimbabwe, what became Ghana. I mean, if you can go down a list of African civilizations well before colonization started. So they weren't really saving us from anything. They came
right.
to take resources, including human resources.
Well,
I'm gonna put that out
Yeah.
there.
No, absolutely. I think it's a and that's part of the formula, right? That's part of the
Hmm.
formula. Part of the justification
Absolutely.
was we're actually not only are there savages, but now we enter in the white hero complex, where the white savior complex, where now we're saving them from their savagery, and
Hmm.
we gave them Christianity, and we brought them to a better, more civilized, more sophisticated way of life. So not
Hmm.
only are they not human, but we are making them human, and we're making them less savage. That was part of, and the only way they could justify that is to erase any sense of identity and credit for the achievements that were made throughout the continent for thousands of years.
so
Yeah,
So
an entire new
let's go
mythology.
to
Yes.
Brandon.
so
Would you define for me, based on everything that we've said so far? You don't have to give me like a textbook definition, but I want you to piece together the elements of what you've been saying so far. Give me your definition of white supremacy.
okay, so again, I would just say that my definition is what I would call well, we have a global world now, so this is what white supremacy is globally. The notion that whiteness is inherently better, sorry, either the subconscious or the implicit or explicit notion that whiteness, the white race, is inherently more moral, more capable, better than other races by nature of their particular skin tone, for lack of a better word, the amount of melanin they have, the fact that they've
The lack
evolved to
thereof.
be that particular color. So the fact that they're white makes them particularly better, and that we've built, and so a white supremacist culture is a culture that has built its systems and structures to reflect this notion, that has built its infrastructure to reflect the notion that white people are superior in these variety of categories by nature of birth and not anything they've actually achieved.
Mhm. And we see this to me, this is the lingering vestiges of that justification that was required to explain why it's okay for us to be equal with the king, but it's also okay for us to keep slaves, because we're equal with the king, but these people are not human. And so from that point forward, everything that was done either implicitly or explicitly to define whiteness as superior to anything else. One, because they had to maintain the system and the justification around that system, but then two, because it became cyclical. It became an echo chamber, or a feedback. The feedback effect became to set in over as the generations came and went, because after a few generations of intentionally practicing the subjugation of people, both physically and social politically, the next generation just automatically does it. And it compounds itself to the point where it no longer has to actively be done. There's no one who has to write anything about these things anymore. There's no one who has to even try to set that narrative in motion. It already has a weight of its own. It already has a momentum of its own. And what we're dealing with today is trying to not only, we're still trying to stop the momentum. We haven't even gotten to a position where we can reverse the momentum that white supremacy set in America from the outset. I want to throw it to you guys. What do you think about that concept, the snowball effect of white supremacy, and the fact that, have we even as Americans, even after 1964, 1965 Civil Rights Voting Rights Act, even after we were recognized as human beings, we're still dealing with the momentum of those decisions that were made during the Enlightenment.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll go first. I would agree. This is sort of cyclical reasoning. We've done two things and created a catch-22 as the result. We've made the biological factors that make people categorize people into race inextricable from the cultural, the culture of places in their and what we consider to be savage or developed, or for lack of a better word, the early onset of respectability politics. So early, and what Michael was saying about the civilization and the civilizations in Africa, that became cyclical reasoning for why there were no civilizations in Africa or even in the New World. It was, well, these civilizations do not look like ours, and we've decided that ours are the most advanced, for lack of a better term, the most advanced. And since they don't look like ours, they are therefore less advanced, and therefore the people who created them, their cultures are less advanced, which must reflect upon their biology because they are biologically, visibly different. And we have yet, like, as you said, we've yet to be able to come to terms with the fact that America in general, in the last 100 years of America, has racism and that colonial mindset built into its structures. So even if people aren't taught these things, there exists a secret curriculum. There exists a subconscious curriculum being taught in schools, being taught by our media, that might as well be teaching it. It reinforces these notions. When you don't see Black people reflected, or Black history reflected, except for once a year, when you don't see Black people on TV in positive roles, it's tantamount to teaching it. It's the same thing. It results in the same kind of effect.
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way, right? I think the easiest way for me to see it are European beauty standards that are so entrenched in the minds of every single American, Black, white, or other, such to the point where we have to unlearn the expectations of that European beauty. We have to we have to deprogram ourselves to realize, like Malcolm said, who told you your hair was too kinky? Who told you your nose was too fat? Who told you your lips were too big? Like it was embedded into our psyche from birth. Every generation gets a brand new dose of what beauty is supposed to look like. And that's just one example of the systemic structure, the structural force of white supremacy. And I just want to throw that out there. Go ahead and take it, Brandon or Michael.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to add is that along with speaking of the momentum of white supremacy, one of the things that we often see is, one of the phenomena we see is, each time we make progress in slowing down the momentum, when we take a breath, there's an infrastructure of power players that works to reverse anything we've had. We saw it when, at the end of slavery, at the end of the Civil War, we saw this explosion, for lack of a better term, this explosion of terrorism within the southern states against the Reconstruction system. So eventually that fell apart. All right, we saw it after the Civil Rights Movement, after the killing of, once we thought we killed Jim Crow, the founding of the modern conservative movement. They worked underneath the covers to knock out the things that we did that were repaired some of the things that some of the forward progress we made are slowing down the momentum of white supremacy in this context. And now here we are. They did such a good job that we're fighting the exact same battles that we fought during the civil rights movement. We're fighting it now with the Black Lives Matter movement and and all the adjacent movements. So we have to keep in mind that, and I think the young people today have a better grasp of it, that we just have to keep pounding away, no matter what's said, no matter what anybody thinks. We just have to keep pounding away at the system. Otherwise, the minute we stop to take a breath, things are gonna start going backwards. All right, and I think that's a big part of the Trump phenomenon. But we're not going to discuss politics right now. But I just wanted to add that in there.
I mean, I think you make a really good point, and it's this, that we may have changed the explicit narrative, but we still exist in a world that is largely the same socially, materially, and politically, in terms of like the realities that people are put into. So it becomes very hard to tell kids that, well, Black people are equal, a class, when they can look around their world and see that to not be the case. I believe everyone here has read Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr.'s book,
Democracy in Black.
And in that he really lays out this old notion that the state structures, whether they be actual structures like buildings or simply legal structures, can only reinforce the values of that state. So when so that's where we get environmental and structural racism. So when you have a racist state, that racism is built into the brick and mortar of every school you build, every road you build, every water treatment plant you build has that sort of white supremacist, and if it's a white supremacist, it must be a black oppressive culture by just by the dichotomy that creates. And you can tell people whatever you want, but if they look outside their window and they see something different, that's just their reality.
Yeah. So it permeates through every level of society, right? And before I go here, I'd like for us to try to think of a parallel that would help someone who nothing's going to help them, but we're going to try to help them anyway. We want to think of a parallel that would help someone who denies the very existence of white supremacy. What can we compare this to throughout history that they can grab hold to and see? This is how they explain X. This is how they explain A to point Z. A being historical, whatever point in history, to Z being today. I mean, there are plenty of studies, there's plenty of fields of study, rather, that show the effects of history on today. And yet, when we talk about white supremacy and the overwhelming impact that 400 years of slavery, not just physical slavery, but emotional slavery and social political slavery and economic slavery has on the current generation, they just get obtuse and say, oh, forget about that. That's the one thing. But the other thing I wanted to say, so I give everybody a chance to kind of think about that. But the other thing I want to say is that this permeates every aspect of our lives, right? I mentioned the beauty standards, just the way we look in the mirror, right? And how we perceive our hair and our skin. And it's because of the images that we've been told is beautiful. It permeates our economic lives because we are a direct result of the income that our parents had to give us, and the wealth, rather, that our parents had to give us. It affects our politics. It affects our eating. It affects our neighborhoods. It affects everything. And yet it seems to be so disconnected from other people. Other people seem to be so disconnected from this reality that something historical has those type of lasting effects today. How do you communicate this to people? Not that we should be concerned about trying to educate them, but sometimes I just like to call BS, right? Because we know that what came before us has an impact on us today. So I'll just toss that out there to you two, as well as the chat room. How do you convey this to them in a way that they understand that these forces are still being felt today?
We don't look to the past. We only look forward.
That's part of the problem, yes.
But what I will say is this. I'm sorry to echo. Okay, what I will say is this. that is why we are having this sort of discussion right now, is because one of the big hurdles to overcome is that people position racism as something that happened in the past. It was something that
Mm-hmm.
happened during slavery, during Jim Crow, during the 60s, before Obama. They keep sort of, changing the metric by which they decide that, well, racism is over because
Yeah.
I'm comparing now to a theoretically worse point in time. And
Mm-hmm.
because we're not there, we must be sort of post-racial. I'm sure people were claiming that we were post-racial right after the Civil Rights Act was passed. I'm sure people were claiming that we were post-racial right after slavery ended. I'm sure people were this narrative, this sort of cycle of, well, here's the new thing that is ending racism is it's just that, it's a cycle. But what I will, to address your first point, what I will say is this: what makes this American racism, modern Western culture racism, so hard to tackle is that it's largely impossible to draw those comparisons, because part of the racism we have now, part of the white supremacism that we have now, is meant to confuse the issue. Prior to this, people were like the caste system in India, for an example. People knew that they were there because of where they were born. People
Mm.
understood that they were there because of the situation they were born in, and there was no way for them to get out except to be reincarnated to a higher position due to good works they did in this life. But the insidious nature of the American white supremacist system is that it pretends like it's a merit-based one. It pretends that people are being based on their achievement and not based on the color of their skin. And so when you try to correct that myth, when you try to say, okay, well, how can you explain X, Y, and Z? They're able to, part of that conditioning is for them to say, well, then they must have deserved it. And that really perforates both every member of society. The idea that, well, I failed because I deserved it if you're black, or he failed because he deserved it, or he was shot because he must have deserved it, because our society is one that is merit based. At least that's the myth. We have this sort of notion that America is the land of opportunity, and if you simply try hard, you can get ahead. That's part of the classist system. That's part of
Mm-hmm.
the sexist system. That's part of the racist system. That the reason people are below us is not because of the way they were born, but because they just simply deserve to be there.
Yeah,
Mm.
I
That's
think part
Go
of
ahead,
the
Michael.
part of the problem is the language, right? So it seems like every era ends with a some sort of rhetorical flourish. Like right now we're in the diversity slash color blindness era, right? So there we've got some sort of tag we can apply to things to make them non-racist, or race doesn't impact these things, right? So if we say everybody should be colorblind, well, if we're blind to color, then we don't have to talk about race, right? So that conversation gets put on the back burner, right? Even though we
Mm.
need to have it, and it should be on the front burner based on the system we live in, and our history as Americans. But we seem to have a way. We constantly have a way to explain away the differences in different communities, right? I had a discussion earlier this week with one of my conservative colleagues. Is that the language we use is very important, right? That it's not that black people are lazy. We have it's changed from not being not we're black people are lazy. We haven't work we don't work hard enough, or we haven't worked hard enough to succeed. So every
Mm-hmm.
generation we have this language change that kind of puts the conversation on the back burner.
Mm. Mm. And now, to add insult to injury, the language of the last 30 years has
Mm-hmm.
been, not only are we lazy, but we're immoral. And the
Yeah,
reason
yeah.
that we're not
Our
successful is
culture is
because
broken. Yes,
we
absolutely.
don't have we need better Judeo Christian values, right?
Yeah,
So
like black
it's
folks don't
always
love
a
Jesus
moving
enough.
goalpost.
I mean, but,
Go
but
ahead.
that's been around. That's been around since the beginning, right? I mean, that was one of the reasons why we had to go into Africa and get these slaves in the first place, because
Mm-hmm.
they were pagan. They were
Mm-hmm.
not
Mm-hmm.
pagans. Well, they were pagans. They were polytheists. They worshiped their ancestors. They prayed to trees and the leopard and all of these other things, and that made them deserving of what's happened. So I mean, the standards have changed. Obviously, the justifications have changed to match whatever uh
But the tools,
scientific, whatever tools, whatever discourse is
yeah.
dominant at the time of the rationalization. But the underlying racism has not. The underlying mentality that these people are, there's something just inherently wrong with them. And it becomes, you have to really explain to people, listen, there is no such thing as American Black culture as something that is distinguishable or extricable from the larger white supremacist culture that exists within
Come
America.
on, man.
You cannot
Come on.
simply, you can't explain the culture, whatever you want to
This
call it, of the Black neighborhoods without really understanding the larger colonial mindset, the larger racist mindset that exists as the larger American culture. Like you can't, like Black culture is simply, or rather, the subset of Black culture is a subset of American culture. It is the reaction to a specific population's place within the broad geographic area that you call America, in the sort of like the philosophical that encompasses, for lack of a better term. So
let's
geographic.
drill down there if you don't mind, because I have a video. I have a 15-minute video of me in Costa Rica arguing with a Bahamian, a Haitian, a Jamaican, and a Costa Rican. All of us of African descent arguing about that exact thing, about African American, Black American culture, and this belief that there's no such thing as Black culture. But then you put it even better, that not only is there such a thing as Black culture, but that Black culture is inseparable from American culture and the effects that American culture has had on Black people. And I had to explain to them, that, you know what, the struggle, the fight, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, that is our culture, because every bit of our existence has been cast by the subjugation that we have been subject to for the last however many hundreds of years. That becomes a part of our DNA. That becomes a part of our culture. That becomes a part of our religious institutions. And then what happens is the need to purge that from our culture and to placate us to the point where we try to find some identity that's not connected to that existence, to that Blackness. And I think that's one of the most powerful tools that can be found. The best example I have, I mean, you could think of it in terms of, let's say, Black conservatives who try to completely disconnect themselves from the civil rights fight, right? They don't disconnect themselves from civil rights. They disconnect themselves from thinking that there's anything to fight for now, right? But then the more transparent version to me is the difference between the Black liberation movement inside of the Black church, the liberation theology in the Black church, and the prosperity gospel, where Black liberation theology in church was 100% about overthrowing institutions of white supremacy, overthrowing the oppressive nature of capitalism in our neighborhoods, 100% about undoing basically whatever Pharaoh had done to the Israelites. Black theology, Black liberation theology was 100% about making sure that we, the children of Israel, were set free from the bondage of Pharaoh, compared to this new version of religion, which is completely separated from the historical Black culture, which is the prosperity gospel, which is completely forget about the historical aspects of how we got here. Let's just talk about how we can name it and claim it, have it and grab it. So I don't speak to that. Just want to throw that out there. Go.
I think Brandon can speak to this better than me, but I think the phenomena of culture is that culture is based on your environment, right? Like we were saying before, the Africans worship what they saw, right? African people worship what they saw. They worship the trees, they worship the sky, they worship the animals, they worship something that they could touch within their environment, right? And we as African Americans, our current culture, for lack of a better word, is a direct reaction to the environment which we find ourselves in through no fault of our own, I might add. Right. So what we see right now is a reaction to social and economic pressures. Like, for instance, if these same economic pressures, you see the same results all over the world, right? You see them in the favelas of Rio. You see them in the tower blocks of London. You see them in Hong Kong. You see them all over the world. The same reaction to the same social and economic pressures. So it's not us. Right. It's how human beings react. We have to take a look at the external pressures that cause this. And that's my opinion. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Brandon.
Well, I want to address what Ben said just really quickly, but what you said really is gonna really set it up. Is that ideology? This is gonna be my controversial statement of the evening. Ideology
Only
for
one to this time.
ideology for the most part is is
Oh
is
yeah,
secondary to the environment that ideology. I'm sorry,
absolutely.
the content of that ideology of a specific, all right, the specifics of an ideology. What are you talking about? Christianity, Islam, blackness, for lack of a better word. So with identity and ideology is always subs as a subset to is always a sorry, it's always a consequence. The specifics of an ideology or an identity or a group is always a consequence of the environment that ideology or group or
Was
identity
born in.
arises in. So when you talk
Yeah,
about the difference between prosperity Christianity, for lack of a better word, and liberation theology Christianity, you're talking about Christianity that arose in two very different contexts. The context in which prosperity, that this notion of money and monetary wealth being equal to your sort of Christian value, your morality, arose in Europe as capitalism rose, and liberation theology arose in various parts of the world as a reaction to colonization, as a
colonialism.
reaction
Yeah,
Internal and
to
external, yeah.
the encroachment of white white Westerners, white Europeans, white United States
The
colonizers,
oppressor, brother.
yeah.
the encroachment of the oppressor, and so you have two different Christianities because you have very two different environments that this sort of Christianity arose inside of. I mean, arose within, and I think that's one of the big takeaways we should take away from tonight is that religion is great, whatever. So is capitalism, so is all these other ideologies, so is feminism, so is anti-racism, but the specifics of that ideology are always going to be the result of whatever environment that that person or that ideology arose in. That is why you can have rich white feminism that is almost indistinguishable from white supremacy because because largely those two things arose in the same kind of environment. If that makes sense, there's the same economic realities, the same material realities affecting the formation of that ideology in that person. And to speak to
Hmm.
the video that Ben brought up about the Jamaican and the Haitians arguing and about
Oh,
black culture.
I didn't put it up. I didn't put it up because I didn't want to. It was close friends, and we got heated because they didn't see that we had a culture. But go ahead.
Well, okay, so there is black culture as prescribed by white America, and then there are the black cultures that black people are able to divide themselves into by nature of a variety of factors, where they came
Mhm.
from, how dark their skin is, their education level, and this is because, and again, because of racism and the fact that we largely group ourselves as a society based on the color of our skin. So we create two different groups, white people and black people. That's the two groups that our society recognizes. And if you're not within one of those groups, you largely view the other group as being completely homogenous. If you ask a white person if there's any difference between a Haitian and a Jamaican in terms of blackness, a racist white person, they'll probably say,
Nope.
no, whatever. But we all know that
Island's an island, yeah.
hierarchy within the black community. There's a hierarchy within the overall black culture that groups
Yep.
people based on where they were born. And that there is a lot of internal strife between different types of blackness. At the same time,
Mhm.
if you ask me like the difference between an Italian and Grecian, or not Grecian, but an Italian and a Czechoslovakian and all the other things, I would be at a law. I mean, I know the difference, obviously, but I'm trying to
Yeah.
make that comparison. That
The
we all
average
that
person.
as black
Yeah.
people, we also view the white community in ways as being kind of homogenous in ethnic terms, if that makes
So
sense.
let's
So
let me. But here's a question to that point, right? You actually kind of here's the problem, and we have to find a solution. The problem is that they're trying to usher blackness in America into this whitewashed, for lack of a better word, this homogenized version of American identity that is indistinguishable from whiteness, right? Just like whiteness is almost a wash. I think they're white people know their culture, they'll know where they're from, but then some won't even know the difference. Some it's almost just a real homogenized group in America, and we're getting more so. If you go back to America 100 years ago, I mean, the Irish versus the Italian was just as tough as black versus white. but they
Mhm.
evolved into this, or I don't know if it's evolution or devolution, right? But they moved into this place of a homogenous group that they all started to enjoy some of the same benefits of America. They're trying to usher, that's what they want for black people. They want us to not have a separate identity that clings to our history, to our culture. They want us to just be homogenized and just become what they are. But the problem is that twofold. One, we don't enjoy the benefits that they get by virtue of their skin color in the United States of America. And that, we could argue about that all day long with them. But the reality of it is, when we get stopped, it's a totally different experience than when someone who's white gets stopped by the police. So they want us to become homogenized without giving us the opportunity or even recognizing that there is a difference between our experiences here. And my question is, how do we not only avoid that, right? I think it's pretty easy to avoid that, but where do we go from here? Because there are constant pressures of assimilation, and we're being assimilated unequally.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're seeing it. I don't know if we're supposed to talk about politics, but I think we see a lot of it. We're seeing shades of it, for lack of a better term. We're seeing shades of it with the Clinton campaign, right? We see them absorbing a certain type of black people, right? A certain uh, um, people who are willing to sign on at any cost to be within those structures, right? So it's kind of it's I didn't want to go here, but it's kind of creepy when you think about it. To my mind, it's kind of creepy that you have to act a certain way and be a certain way in order to be accepted
Yeah,
within that group, right? And it attracts a certain type of person, someone that's willing to um,
conform.
assimilate at any cost. They want to be part of the
Yeah,
in group. Now, not saying that they're wrong because of the social economic pressures on the other side, sort of chasing them into this in group. Okay, I don't need any of those headaches. I'm going to try to push myself into closer to this to the in group. So I think we have to find a way, not separate but equal, but find a way to have our own identity while still taking part in the American experiment. And part of that is the dominant society has to accept us in as we are, just like they did with the Italians, just like they did with the Jews to a degree, to the Irish. They got absorbed in to the in group, but they still maintain their individuality or their individual cultures. There's St. Patrick's Day. Uh,
yeah.
there's plenty of holidays. The Columbus Day for the Italians. I don't know why you celebrate that, but that's something they do. Uh, so I just want to be clear that there is a way to be part of American society and to be have your full citizenship and have all the perks and all the responsibilities that go with it, because we got plenty of responsibilities and not all of the perks, and
Mm-hmm,
still have
mm-hmm.
our own identity. There is a way, but for some reason, I guess for obvious reasons, they don't. The dominant society doesn't want us to have our own identity. I'm sorry,
Because
that doesn't
and
answer
Brandon,
your
I want you
question,
to.
Ben, but I just want to
I,
put
I,
that out there.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah. No, no, appreciate it. Again, I won't, Brandon. I want you to address it, but I wanted
Mm.
to put it in context as to why I'm asking. Because as we described the nefarious nature of how it's being cast as meritocratic now instead of a
That's
result of
corrosive.
America's own caste system, right? The way we fight back against that right now and historically has been clinging to our culture, which our culture is activism, civil rights, the struggle. That is our culture, right? So, how would we ever fight back against this idea that the only problems in the African American community are meritocracy or lack thereof, versus these compelling forces to conform to this homogenized version of America, completely devoid of any connection to our past? How do we balance those two fights?
Well, I think the pressure to conform that comes as part of this sort of respectability politics, this tone policing of blackness, for lack of a better word, the idea that if black people just behaved properly, and properly as a code word for white, they would get ahead is meant to further reinforce that idea of a meritocracy. It is literally meant to counter the notion that we have a race-based caste system. But so part of tackling this issue is really explaining to people that there is no way for black people to, so for lack of, let's use an example, there is no way for me to be the perfect American male, because part of being the perfect American male is being white. Like, there are certain categories that America has decided makes you the perfect, that are simply unavailable to certain people by nature of their birth. And just that sort of factor, and I mean not just people who may or may not have developmental disabilities, so things like that. But I mean, but also those people, let's be honest, people like that, people who have a variety of things that they are born with that prevent them from ever being able to reach the upper echelon of what America would consider to be perfect. It is impossible for a black male to be perfect in America, no matter what he does. And the argument that he can be is a cyclical one, because it is meant to both reaffirm the idea of a meritocracy, and so people don't have to feel that kind of white guilt, that the racial baggage from years ago, and also to, to basically make a certain group of people feel better about being on top. Like that's really the goal here. It's to make white Americans feel better about being on top, because they deserve it. It's not something that was handed to them. They deserve it. Like it's so important that we really emphasize the fact that part of the racial system, that a racist system that America is built upon, encompasses the notion of meritocracy at its core, because that becomes so key to keeping the narrative going, that otherwise people might suffer from something called empathy. Like if you were forced, if you were forced to come to terms with the fact that you are ahead in life, but not only that you are ahead in life, but you are ahead and other people are not getting the bare necessities, would force you to come to terms with the fact that society is not fair, and that might cause you not only to argue against racism, but to argue against capitalism. And I think this is where we get to something like the 80s and 70s and 90s, and we start talking about the ways in which neoliberalism fits into racism, specifically the ways in which identity politics, the right attacked identity politics as a counter to the era of civil rights era in the 60s and 70s, as a way to basically deregulate organizations. Like that was actually part, and this is a sort of lesser known thing about the attack on identity politics, not the way it exists now, but the way it exists, because back then the caricature that the right made of identity politics then is kind of what it exists as now. But this was a way to justify deregulation and rolling back the powers of the American government. So you say you had people in the government on the right who wanted to deregulate banks, saying that the government is overreaching into your social lives. They are integrating schools, they are giving money to the welfare queen, they are expanding the welfare state, they're giving all of your money to these black people who are, I don't know, smoking joints and chasing white women. My weekend, so I can't speak to the veracity of that for everyone else. This is how I spend my time. But so like this also becomes the way that we get people mobilized against racism. We get people mobilized against sexism by really explaining to them the social cost for everybody that racism has in America. So we really say, do you know why we have such a weak social security system, such a weak welfare system, such a weak unemployment system? Because of racism. Because that was the way in which it was originally justified by Reagan, by Clinton, by all of these legislators.
It goes back to we'll pick up right where you left off, but you said something in there that was critical. You said that the perfect black person is a white person, according to standards, right? There's no amount of fixing that you could do. Ultimately, it's a cyclical force that's going to continue to have you always chasing your tail, trying to become a better person. Ultimately, you will never reach their goal because what they're looking for is a white person. Here's a perfect example of this in reality happening. This week, the black doctor, I'm sure everyone knows the story by now, the OBGYN who was on the flight to Delta, her name was Tamika Cross, Dr. Tamika Cross. Here's a person, a passenger dying, and they ask for a doctor. And she stands up, says, I am a doctor. And she is immediately dismissed as not being a doctor, despite her saying, I am a licensed doctor. And here we are, somebody's almost dying. And because this person was not seen as someone who could possibly be a doctor, she was dismissed almost to the demise of a person. This shows you, like, here she is. I'm sure she wasn't flying, and not that it would matter, right? I don't care. I don't care what my doctor is wearing when I'm in need. I don't care if she was wearing whatever. I don't care if she's coming straight from the club, right? But I'm sure she was probably dressed whatever kind of way she was dressed on a flight, dressed professionally or not. She presented herself as a doctor, and she was dismissed as not being one. And you cannot tell me that it was not as a result of her gender and her skin. Her skin first, then her gender, or probably a combination of the equal of the two. So this is a perfect example. Like, we can chase this all we want, but ultimately we'll never reach that level of perfection that they're looking for. Nor do people like me, do I even have time to chase after that. Let's move the conversation forward a little bit. Go ahead, Brandon.
I was gonna say a similar situation happened at a bank, I believe, where there was a black female architect, and the bank simply did not believe her.
Oh yeah,
because of the size of her check,
Bank,
right?
yeah, because
They
the size of her
couldn't
check.
believe
They
how
did not
much her
believe.
check was.
I mean, but at the same time, it's the manner in which she was dressed was not fitting to that sort of white stereotype of what you have to look like. She was just dressed. I would argue that a lot of black women dress within black society. They dress different from white women. The way white women dress for who operate in mostly white societies. Just it is what it is.
Right. But now let's be sure. Had it been a white woman who came in there in yoga pants and her workout outfit and her hair all thrown, however it was thrown, they would not have asked her the same questions, right? So yes, there are all kind of forces at play here, but the common denominator across all of them definitely is race. So let me ask you this. I want you to give us some takeaways. Brandon first and Michael, give us some takeaways. What do we take from this conversation as we get ready to move forward to the next conversation?
Let me hop in there right quick, Brandon, and then I'll let you close it out. One of the factors while we were sitting here talking, something occurred to me that didn't occur to me before, is that we're kind of in this our black people in America. We're kind of in this. We've come to be in this social limbo, right? We're not exactly. We can't be. We're not being absorbed into the greater community because we're quote unquote different, right? Because we're different culturally, we're different visually. At the same time, based on social and economic pressures or social and economic policy, our right to self-determination as a community has been hampered, right? So we have like the Asian communities, they have their self-determination. They can stay in their communities. Their communities are prosperous because money's trapped staying inside of that community. Our communities, because we were not allowed to build wealth. We weren't allowed to create businesses because of redlining. You couldn't be insured. All these things over time that would put us in this position. So we're kind of in this limbo. We were not allowed self-determination, and we're not allowed to be in the big boys club. So we're kind of in this social limbo. And I think part of that has to be explained to people. I mean, obviously they have to be receptive to it, right? They have to be receptive to the conversation, and not everyone is. And that's also part of our greater American culture, is that whatever we say is a reason, no matter what kind of scientific or visual or anecdotal evidence we have, it's an excuse. That's the big word. It's an excuse. It's an excuse for not being successful. Everybody's got the same opportunities, so on as that same meritocratic rhetoric. And we have to keep all that in mind when we're having these conversations, because there's always going to be somebody that says, well, that's an excuse. Well, here's a study that says it's not. But oftentimes when you start going down that goat rope, they're not listening anyway. Sometimes it's just best to walk away. But at the same time, we have to be prepared to have these conversations and have our body of evidence ready to go. All right, that's all I got. Brandon?
Well, what I think is important to remember is that where we are today as a society, both culturally, socially, structurally, infrastructurally, is founded upon a foundation or base of white supremacist thought. So as we move into our next panel on the education system and the ways in which Black Lives Matter and racism has massive effects on the way we teach each other, we should remember that the schools that we build are built with the bricks of racism, for lack of a better term. The curriculum we build is filtered through a lens of racism. The laws that we have are filtered through a lens of racism. So we have to be able to not only identify laws that are inherently racist, but also identify the ways in which laws that are theoretically supposed to be unbiased. So, for example, say a stop and frisk bill, which is not necessarily racist in and of itself, but has a racist implementation. We have to be able to really dig deep into the ways that which racism has infiltrated literally every aspect of our society, because that is just the way America. That's what America is founded upon. America as a concept and as a country has race at its foundation, and the unequal distribution of power amongst races as literally one of the biggest sort of thought experiments that went through people's heads as the country was being founded. So we have to be able to draw those parallels between now and then.
I would like to know, because, I would like to know from an anthropological perspective, from actually like documents, right? Because we know this intuitively, right? We can derive with our own thought experiments today what was done back then. But tell the audience, what books should we grab that give us a good look at the thought experiments that were done, and they were done to overcome the cognitive dissonance of we're equal with the king, but we're not equal with the slave.
Well, I mean, you could read a lot of just basic alignment philosophy, but again, you're going to see the erasure of the idea of slavery from that sort of thing. If you want to read about slavery in America from that kind of perspective, you can read what is it called? Democracy in America by the French name. I'm totally I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head. I can look it up, but and I should know.
Yeah, let's get it. You don't have to have it right now. If you want to get it and circle back and share it on Twitter, I'm going to buy those books. We'll read them and then dissect them and discuss them.
Well, other things you can read. A good book to read is The Mismeasure of Man, which really talks about the myth of a connection between culture and intelligence and biology that a lot of early anthropological work, a lot of early racial work was meant to sort of draw these conclusions based on the morphology of Black and white people and make conclusions on intelligence, conclusions on cultural value from those things. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America. You can get it for like $5. I looked it up. John Thomas Jefferson's, one of the earliest works on race in America was Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia. Which was not necessarily about race, but race plays a big part. And he does a lot of theorizing on the difference between white people, Black people, and Native Americans. And what else is good to read about just the idea of the early race? Because you're right. At this point, it's become so ingrained in liberal thought that these things are just myths that you don't normally read the actual books about it. So I would argue that the good place to start is The Mismeasure of Man, because that will present you with the arguments that were made and then the counter arguments to that sort of thing. Because I don't really advocate people having to read like go back and read like the racist philosophy surrounding racism in America. If you are interested in that, I would say look up the American School of Anthropology. If you search that into Google, you can go to Wikipedia page and they'll show you a lot of stuff about race. Race in America is not my field of expertise. Like I know the
Okay.
basics of it, so I don't read a lot about historical racism. But the American School of Anthropology, it was basically the founding school of racism, which is so sad in the world. So if you search it, you'll find a lot of good. If you search it into Google, you'll find a lot of good sources. If you really want to read that sort of stuff, if you want to read how IQ tests and stuff are skewed to sort of
Mhm.
give the illusion of this meritocratic system, the Myth Measure of Man is your best place to go for that.
Mm. Awesome. All right. So what we're gonna do is they're gonna shift into a small segment, final segment. Michael Redwine is gonna take the lead on that and discuss the remainder of the conversation here, along with the conversation about the upcoming panels. I'm personally going to have to say goodnight. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys, but I'm downtown Boston and I have to get to the South Shore before my wife gets a little too impatient. So I wanted to hang out with you guys on my night off. And Brandon, it's been an enlightening conversation. Michael, you had some brilliant things to contribute, and I will turn it over to you guys to finish the conversation. So thanks a lot for having me.
Thanks for coming through, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thank
Hey,
you
my
so much,
pleasure.
Ben, for filling in last minute.
Hey, my pleasure. Take care.
All right, so that was Benjamin Dixon. Check him out Monday through Thursday on right here on the Benjamin Dixon YouTube network. Was it 9 to 10, I believe, Eastern? Yeah, 9 to 10 Eastern. So we're gonna Brandon and I are gonna go on the next panel. I'm going to take the lead on that panel. It's gonna be about socioeconomic factors and race and education and things that again, like this panel, that kind of show us how we got to the position we are in as a nation, not just Black people, but where we are as a nation, and the role that that the civil rights movement and now Black Lives Matter, which is maybe better termed as civil rights movement 2, because they are fighting many of the same battles, and we're just here sort of trying to help, and not that they need our help. We're just trying to add to the conversation to assist in their efforts.
Well,
Brandon, did you have anything to say about this conversation we just had?
we have a few questions from the chat that we can
We
talk
got
about for a
questions from the
second.
chat. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I've been trying to. I haven't just been texting people. I've also been looking at the chat
I
conversations.
thought you
So
were being player. All right, go ahead. Any business.
I was doing that too. So there's one question from Rebecca G. Do any of you think simply leveling the playing field socially and otherwise would bring about equality in America? So I would say that you can't really level the playing field socially, because that would involve undoing the just generations and generations of social conditioning that people, indoctrination in terms of racism that people have been dealt to them. But they have done studies that show that black and brown kids who start with the same basic, generational wealth, same basic income, do just as well as their white counterparts. Like that is not, there is no sort of difference when you put black and white kids within like the same material reality. So we say a white family in a suburb and a black family in the suburbs, and they both have the same amount of money in the bank. They have the same, sort of structured life. They pretty much have the exact same outcome in terms of school and that sort of thing. So I mean, I think that largely we have to level the playing field economically first, and part of the way we do that is leveling it socially. Part of the way we do that is integrating society in a meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things I talk about it almost anytime Brandon and I sit down is one of the phenomena that we saw during this political cycle is the phenomena of economics not being a black issue, which to me was absolutely galling, and I'm still upset about it. I'm absolutely still upset about it. There's no way in the world we can say that economics and social conditions are not black issues. Now, not to answer the question, but to add to what Brandon said, I think it goes. I think the key is economics. I think there's really no way around that, because money is power in this country, right? You can't. Go ahead, Brandon.
To you real quick. So
Go ahead.
the
I see.
reason why economics is not a black issue to the political elite is because the political elite are rich.
Yeah,
Elite are
absolutely.
rich. So economics is not an issue to them.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
not an issue to it is not an issue to economic plight of black people. It's not their main issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because and this goes back to what I said earlier, their definition of racism, so their ideological definition of racism is a result of the material reality they live within. So if you ask a rich a rich black person what the problem with blackness is, what's the problem with what racism is in society, they are simply going to point to those small discrepancies in representation. They're going to point to the fact that if they turn on the TV, they don't see enough black people. They'll point to the fact that if they go to the mall, they'll be followed. They'll point to the fact that certain X, Y, and Z occurs, that they got passed down for a promotion at the law firm. Which that is racism. Those outcomes, those phenomena that I've just described are a result of the same structural racism. But I would argue, and this is not to rank oppression, although I'm going to rank oppression because you can't. Here's the thing: you can rank oppression. People say you shouldn't rank oppression. What they're saying is that I recognize that the oppression I am under is not the lowest, so I don't want to. But in reality, what they're saying is that all oppression is born from the same core of racism. But we have to learn what we should be tackling first, and also learn that if we simply a lot of times if we simply tackle the sort of the maldistribution of resources that occurs under economic racism, that the sort of social aspects of it can also be tackled much quicker. They will be tackled as a byproduct.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you reinvest in the black community, if you give black people, or not if you give, if black people are given the opportunity to better themselves economically, you'll see more black TV shows.
Mm-hmm.
You'll see more black-owned law firms.
Because we've always done that, and because that's what we do. If we're given the opportunity, we take it and run with it. No one on this planet can say we don't. You can look around and at any area where the playing field, quote unquote, was leveled, whether it be sports, whether it be entertainment, we take the ball and we run with it, and we change the game oftentimes, right? So the whole notion of our laziness, the whole notion of us not being able to apply ourselves, right? The whole notion of us not being able to commit, right? Our entire sports entertainment um, universe in our country is dominated by black people because we're willing to commit. We're smart enough to handle these things. We're strong enough to deal with these things. All these things are possible if the opportunities are available. And that opportunity gap is huge. Now back to answering the question. Okay, the issue for me, this is Michael Redwine's standpoint. This is not something you're going to find in the textbook. You may find in the textbook, because just it wouldn't be one I read. All right, is that you're going to have to, in order to fix things socially, as Brandon said, you're going to have to fix them economically, because that's the foundation of it, right? It's a foundation of economics. It's a foundation socially, which includes on the social side that includes education, right? And we have to change our policy, right? We have to have policy that impacts people for involving themselves in racist activities, right? So if we have a law in the books that says that you must allow everyone to come in your restaurant and partake in your eats equally as everyone else, if there is no negative impact on not following that law, that it's not a law, right? There has to be an impact, right? So if there is a group of people who wants to kill a bunch of black people or a bunch of white people or a bunch of anybody, right? If there is no robust enforcement measures in place to enforce those laws, they don't matter, right? So we need to fix the problems. We need a economic uplift. At this point, we're taking whatever form it comes. A $15 minimum wage would be a great start, right? If we can get the minimum wage up, if we can improve our education system, if we can improve loans to at-risk communities, improve the schools in at-risk communities. I mean, there is more jobs, as in Job Corps, more opportunities for Job Corps, infrastructure, which would be a huge boom for jobs in the country and for small business. There is a plethora of things that we can do to level the playing field, but primarily beyond the economic, along with the economic piece, it has to be a robust policy initiative with a very robust enforcement structure, so everyone knows what the cost is of not doing these things. Right. I'm not saying we need to go shoot up we need to go, blow up your place if you don't want to let black people in or you don't want to let brown people in. What I'm saying is we need to have a fair system in place with a robust enforcement structure. And I think it's not going to happen overnight. Right. We're going to have to it's going to take time. Right. And there's going to be some pushback. There's going to be a whole lot of pushback because there always is when it comes to change, no matter what kind of change that is.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. One of them is people end up marrying people that look like themselves. Is it a conspiracy? No, people end up marrying people who resemble people they're surrounded by. So if you have an unintegrated society, people will most likely marry people who look like them because they are surrounded by people who look like them. People don't necessarily marry people who remind them of themselves in a mirror. People marry people who they become accustomed to being surrounded by, because proximity and conditioning breeds attraction. So you're attracted to people that you've been around your whole life. No.
Go ahead, Big Dave.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Hey all, I'm just unmuting myself for a second and coming in from the production room here.
This is David Carson, by the way. He's the producer of the Benjamin Dixon Show, and all around great guy. And he takes care of all of us, keeps us out of trouble. Go ahead, Dave.
Appreciate that. Now I just would pose the question: how general would you apply that to? And obviously, it doesn't. Not everyone fits under that frame or in that frame. The reason I pose it is because my family is predominantly European immigrants, Jewish. I don't observe, but my girlfriend is Dominican. So I didn't grow up around Dominicans. Largely I was in Jersey, suburbia. Now I'm in New York. But my point is,
Jersey,
I guess
baby.
New York's won me over. How would you frame that in a general sense versus when you look at things on the ground, on a micro level?
Okay. So we're talking about general trends right now. So you can't account. So I think the number is that around 90% of people marry someone of the same race. And if you look at statistics, again, these are off the top of my head, guys. So if you somehow find out that these are a little bit off, is because these are off the top of my head. So I think around 90% of people.
I'm also putting Brandon on the spot, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here.
No, he's the pro. Get it.
I could have just said there's no accounting for taste, and you have good taste, Dave. But no. Okay, so 90% of people marry people of the same race as them. But we also live in a society where about 80% of people don't really have have a friend circle that includes people of a different race than them, specifically white people. And if you can also go further and tie this into Black Lives Matter and say only about 35% of white people, if I'm not mistaken, recognize that there is a problem with the way that police handle Black communities. And so what we're talking about here is now empathy. Empathy as a general term for how you feel and relate to people who look different than you. People who are different than you, in this case, racially different. And so part of the way you become attracted to somebody is empathy. You have to be empathetic to it. You have to recognize that they are a person and that they are equal to you and that you can be attracted to them. And the way you breed empathy is through integration, by putting people in a situation that they learn to grow with these people. And we don't have an integrated society. So when people say, oh, well, people marry within the same race, and that 90% of crime is intraracial. That includes white on white crime and black on black crime, for lack of a better term. So white people commit crimes with white people at an 88% rate, and black people commit crimes against black people at around 90%. And some people say that, oh, well, black on black crime. It's like, no, society is segregated. Because society is segregated based on race and based on class. And since there's a huge intersection between the black community and the poor community, you get what you get. Ultimately, though, the key to all of these issues, the solving of the issue, is a comprehensive integration of society. And that's why I say that I avoid reducing everything down to the sort of Marxian economics and capitalism is the source of all evil, because people don't see it that way. Largely, a large portion of society, I would say the majority of society, does not break the world down to the flow of capital. They break down the world to just more ethereal concerns, and so you can't communicate that to them in any real way unless they already have drunk the Kool-Aid. If they've already read Marx and they believe Marx, that's great. And I'm not saying Marx is wrong. I'm saying people who think that the world breaks down to capital is wrong. That's a very Marxian argument. I would just say that not every solution, not every economic solution is better than every social solution. I mean, sorry, rather, yeah. Theoretically, so we'd say, okay, for example, let's contrast, let's come up with solutions to the plight of Black people. One solution would be, say, a comprehensive reparations plan. We're going to give reparations, a certain amount of money, a certain amount of land, a certain amount of mules to Black people who have ancestry in America going back 4 generations or more. Another solution that I would argue would be a more social solution would be, we're going to properly integrate schools. We're going to do nothing else for the community but properly integrating schools, properly integrating all public places, properly integrating all aspects of public life that the government has control over, and a more robust affirmative action program. Looking at this intersection there, I would absolutely prefer the latter to the former, because the influx of capital into communities that are not used to capital is not going to do anything. And of course, there's a difference between social capital and economic capital. Mm-hmm. Access to one affects your access to the other. You can't simply say, well, if you give enough money to Black people, they can escape the bonds of racism. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. But more likely, they'll fall back into that system, or they'll become an anomaly, and it won't really affect the larger way society views Black people in general. I think that we've proven nothing else, that the proliferation of Black faces in the media, whether they be sports stars or rappers or random member on TV, has not had the effect of empathizing people towards the Black community. If nothing else, it's just made caricatures. It furthers certain stereotypes.
Let me push back. I mean, I'm not a Marx guy, but I'm going to push back on the economic thing, right? Because this country has used economics to split us apart, right? When neighborhoods are based on your income, right? So and we've assured that certain people don't have the types of income to get to these nicer neighborhoods, right? We've assured that was going to happen through policy and practice, right? And that was and the structures we have now is a result of those economics. Now, if we're going to integrate schools, we're going to be putting poor kids around rich kids, and never the twain shall meet. They'll be in the same building, but they're not going to hang out. They're not going to talk. If you go to any, like my kids go to a super integrated high school here at Huntsville High in Alabama, right? They go to this super integrated high school, but a lot of times you see these kids will hang out with their peer groups that they know, the people they know, the people they hang out with, the kids, the people that their parents know. Those are the social groups based on economic structures. That's what I'm talking about, right? That's how our country is split up right now. Whether we like Marx or not, that's how this is how we decided things were going to go. Back in I guess in the 70s, we decided, okay, we can't say, N-word. We're going to make sure they can't prosper. And we're going to make sure this group that does prosper gets to split as much as possible. That's why the wealth gap is increasing. That's why the has increased. That's why when we had the crash, this group got hit harder than this group because they had more generational wealth. We can't just say that the intersection of race and economics isn't a factor or is less of a factor than like a lot of us like to think. Because if you're broke, you can't break through these structures. It's just twice as hard.
I actually agree with you, and that's not what I was trying to imply. My implication.
We hurt my feelings anyway.
Okay, well, you know what? You'll get over it. Anyway, what I was trying to imply was that the problem I largely had with early Bernie Sanders, and I think he corrected this in his later term, was that he tried to reduce everything down to capitalism and economics without explaining how he got there without really making those steps clear to people and explaining how race is a red herring for a lot of things. Race is a red herring for a lot of things at the top level because let's be honest, the 1% doesn't care if you're black, large doesn't care if
Oh,
you're
they
black or
sure don't.
brown or white.
All
Some of them,
these
some
races
of them
split us
might
up. That's all they care about.
they for large only care about money. But what I will
Absolutely.
say, but I would say those of us in the lower 99 care a lot more about race. We like race is a reality insofar as it is a social reality and it has an actual effect on people's lives. I said race is not a biological reality. It is founded upon certain biological characteristics, but the social the social reality of race has very real biological consequences, and that explains the health gap between black and brown people and white people, even at the exact same economic level. You say, like there is a health gap even when you look at white and brown black people who make the same amount of money. So there's obviously something going on here with the race that cannot, and I know I'm pulling facts out of thin air that you don't know if they're true or not, because I'm just
Magic.
saying them.
It's
I
magic.
and I of course I encourage people to look up these facts for themselves. I mean, what I'm saying is largely true, and I can't think of the exact numbers. I'm not going to say them, but there is actually a depth gap between black and white people that is irrespective of class, that's irrespective of their amount of money, that is largely thought to be attributed to the stress of being black within society, the social stress, the stress of being feel like you constantly have to prove yourself because you are black. You have to work harder in X, Y, and Z. So when I say that the intersection of race and class is very important, because race is largely meant to obscure class, and the sort of the unequal distribution of wealth largely affects people of the oppressed races more heavily as the result of racism and lack of that buffer from generational wealth. I just think that it's a mistake to try to reduce everything down to class, even if it's true, because people don't see the world that way. Like largely the world, being black means things to certain people. So you got to meet them where they're at in terms of trying to preach your solution to problems.
Agreed. All right, so we're getting ready to wrap it up here, folks. I just want to make sure that we let you know that our next panel is going to be on October 28th, and as it stands right now, the wonderful Nina Turner is going to sit in. All right, I won the panel lottery. She's going to sit in on my lottery on my panel, on the panel on the October 28th. Same bad time, same bad channel. I just aged myself, but we're not going to talk about that.
I love that show. That's a great show.
Yeah, it was. All right, so we just want to, if you have any other questions, we'll try to. If you can reach me on Twitter. It's right below my face here. Mike_Redwine on Twitter, and you can reach Brandon, the expert here, at what is your Twitter handle there, Brandon?
I can never remember off the top of my head. We'll link it to you.
It is
Yeah.
PS_ABS opinion, because I had to type it.
I'm gonna change that. That's really long and complicated.
Yeah, it is long and complicated. Well, in any event, if Dave, if you don't mind, can you put our Twitter handles in the
They're already there.
They're already there. Okay, great. All right, that's why Dave is Dave. All right, so the next one is going to be the factors, education, socioeconomics. What's the one after what's the following two, Dave?
I am putting it on screen right now. So
Jungle
following
Fever,
this one,
Dave story.
What?
Don't listen to Brandon. Don't listen to Brandon.
Let's move on.
Yeah, please.
It's on screen anyway right now. So
Okay.
Mike Redwines is going to be the factors: education, socioeconomics, and poverty. The following one will be honoring those lost and trying to determine what we can do to honor them, not so that all of these numerous stories that we keep hearing and talking about aren't just in vain for nothing. Black Lives Matter beyond the names. And then the final one, and there may very well be more to come, but the final one as of now will be government and citizen activism.
All right, Dave was cool enough to read that stuff off. If you have any ideas for panels, things you'd like to hear us talk about, or if you'd like to be involved in a panel, or if you know someone that we should have on a panel, a writer or an activist, whatever you got, give us a shout. Give Dave and Anoa are really running the show here. Me and Brandon are just running our mouths. So you can give anybody a shout.
Oh, I'm also a staff writer for the progressivearmy.com, and I have a new article out today that you should check out.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you
That's
have
a great
free
article.
time. I have a new article out on the progressivearmy.com. I'm a much better writer than I am a speaker. Talker, person who orates, whatever. It's called the Hillary or Bust Movement, aka the DNC. So it's on the front page. Check it out.
Mm-hmm. We're not gonna get into politics right now. Okay, so again, we're gonna on the 28th was our next panel. We're trying to do them. They're trying to do them every 2 weeks, within reason, because people have lives outside of what we do here at the Progressive Army. So Brandon, I'll let you close it out. What do you got for the people other than your awesome article that you released today?
Honestly, I don't really feel that kind of insecurity about not being the beauty standards, because I have an incredible amount of vanity.
I didn't notice at all.
So
Missed that.
I can't relate to you guys in terms of that, because when I see people and I see pretty people in the media, I'm like, why don't they look like me? That's my sign off.
That was Brandon. That's Brandon's sign off. All right. Number one, I'd like to thank Big Dave Grossman. Like I said, he is the heart of the Progressive Army. Don't let anybody fool you. Ben is the boss, but the heart of the Progressive Army is Dave Grossman, and never forget that. All right, and that's it for me, Mike Redwine, Brandon Sutton, and Big Dave. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for hanging out with us. And as Ben said, you could have been anywhere, but you decided to be here. And thank you.
Check out Dave's new mixtape.
Good night, all. Have a good weekend.